Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from the Eli Young Band, titled 10,000 Towns. So okay, here's one of the frustrating things about mainstream country artists. Since so many of them have their songs written by other songwriters entirely, it can kind of distort your mental picture of an act's identity. That tends to be a complaint at the root of a lot of critics' issues, including my own, with bro country. When so many of the songwriters come from the exact same camp and write for so many different artists, acts that should have their own unique, distinctive voice, they start to blur together a bit. But rarely has there been a case where my view of an act has been so sharply divided as when I'm talking about the Eli Young Band. They were around in the country underground as early as the mid-2000s, but they exploded into mainstream prominence and popularity in 2011 with their album Life at Best. And considering I was only really following country radio and less distinctive albums around that period, I was really kind of perplexed by the Eli Young Band that they could have such a variance in quality, as Even If It Breaks Your Heart was close to one of my favorite songs of 2012, and Crazy Girl would have had a shot at being one of the worst. So, in preparation for doing this particular review, I went back and listened through Life at Best, and surprise, surprise, both songs were written by different songwriters, and neither were members of the Eli Young Band. Crazy Girl was primarily written by Lee Brice, one of the most meat-headed and devoid of insight songwriters working currently in bro country right now, while Even If It Breaks Your Heart, well, that song was written by Eric Posley, who I reviewed a month or so ago with his debut album, and it's only been getting better and better every time I listen to it. So even with that, I didn't have a real picture of how the Eli Young Band represented themselves as an act. So I decided to go even deeper into their album, and, well, they're not bad, but they didn't really stand out much for me. I liked the heavier guitars, I liked that they had a really good lyrical flow, and I did kind of like the melancholy elements that were well characterized and reasonably intelligently delivered, but between the sloppy and often flat production and the strange dreariness that bogged down and homogenized parts of that album, I wouldn't really call it a great record. And thus, I didn't know what to expect when going into their newest album, 10,000 Towns. They had the same number of songwriting credits roughly, but the initial buzz suggested that this album had a much lighter tone. So overall, how'd it go? Well, it's okay, but it's not great. If Life at Best presented the Eli Young Band as a very serviceable country music act that lies closer to the harder edges of the pop country scene, 10,000 Towns cements that reputation. In other words, it's mostly good, but not great, and it's not exactly an album that will stick around for very long in my memory. And while there are promising signs on this album that make this record a little bit easier to listen through than their last one, none of these ideas are developed enough to give this record some real staying power, at least for me. So, okay, let's start with the instrumentation, where at first glimpse, you might think things that have taken a turn for the better. The production is more expansive and textured. Both electric and acoustic guitars have more energy and some real feeling behind them. There are some more guitar solos, and generally the lighter, more upbeat tone, it's a good fit for the band and with their harmony-rich backing vocals, most of which actually do manage to sound quite cohesive, which can be a problem when it comes to mainstream country. But it didn't take long to notice that most of the instrumental texture just drops out entirely when it comes to choruses, which sound overproduced and obscure any real instrumental melodies. And what gets even worse is that if you listen for those melody lines, they aren't that interesting, mostly sticking to very conventional progressions that don't have a lot of memorability or real staying power. There are moments where things do get interesting. There are hints of accordion on Your Last Broken Heart and A Lot Like Love, the piano line in What Does, and the harder edges on Revelations, but I have to stress this, these are only fleeting glimpses of what it could have been a more diverse and interesting country album. The one good thing I can say about the production is that it feels a lot more cohesive and well-structured than in comparison with their last album, even to the point where the electronic elements, even though they're noticeable, they do blend more subtly into the mix. Now, let me stress one thing here, that there's nothing wrong with writing more simple instrumentation, providing that you can make it up with it in other areas. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of hope for making it up in the vocals, which takes us to Mike Eli. He reminds me a fair bit of Billy Currington with his hangdog roughness to his voice, which can be emotionally effective if he's trying and he's actually pushing himself. But the sad problem is that with most of this album, he doesn't really seem to be doing that. And since he doesn't doesn't exactly have killer stage presence or a ton of charisma, it can make some songs come across as really quite bland. The absolute worst of the bunch is the title track, which takes on a very, very basic bro country formula, and Mike Eli does absolutely nothing to redeem it with even the slightest bit of genuine investment. On the other hand, if he's given some more emotionally gripping material, he can make it work. And the better songs of this album, they do work pretty well in that vein. But like as always, that comes back to the songwriting. And like with the last album, we've got a real mixed bag here. I've already mentioned the title track, but on the same very low rung is Revelations, a song that completely squanders a good hard edge and a pretty decent vocal performance, all things considered, with some truly obnoxious lyrics about catching a fiancé cheating and thanking God that he dodged that bullet. Real classy, dude. Where this album does score points, though, is when it goes for some real heartfelt sincerity. As much as the clumsy double rhyme in Your Last Broken Heart in the chorus annoys me, the lyrics, they do come across as heartfelt, and that did work. Hell, even the lead single Drunk Last Night manages pretty well in that regard, despite some lyrical clumsiness and unnecessary defensiveness, capturing the hungover apologies that come from calling an ex and then having to explain themselves in the morning. That does have some legitimate connotations. That could work, but like always, when the band actually goes for real nuance, they can really deliver. The best song on this album by a mile is Who Does, a song about a failing marriage that is just really heartbreaking to listen through, as it shows how both sides really tried their best and gave it their all to save things, but sometimes it just doesn't work out. But not far behind that song is A Lot Like Love, a song where the narrator is reminiscing on a past relationship that he thought might have been love, but then he walked away from it because of his ego and bad decisions that he made in his past when he was trying to be a big swaggering tough guy. And what I like about the song is that it doesn't really give him a straight answer. It might have been love, but it might not have, with the drama really coming from the uncertainty and the questions he'll never be able to ask now of that girl. That's a mature direction, and it's kind of risky to go in that particular straight. And you know what? I did like it. But overall, 10,000 Towns by the Eli Young Band, it's okay. Decent, agreeable, an album that's got a few good tracks, a few bad ones, and a whole lot of really just passable in between. In terms of mainstream country music, the best adjective I could use to describe the Eli Young Band would be consistent. And while I might wish that Mike Eli pushed himself a little bit harder, the lyrics were a little bit more dynamic and interesting, the compositions were a little bit more fluid and, again, a little bit more interesting, and the production gave those guitars some really more meat and prominence, I can't exactly fault an album that manages to roughly succeed in its goals, if not all that much excel. So you know what, I'm gonna give this album a 6 out of 10 and a moderate recommendation. If you're a fan of the Eli Young Band, it's worth a few listens. Otherwise, only if you find agreeable to be enough in terms of your music. Otherwise, nah. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Yes, the David Nail review is on its way. Don't be prepared for an entirely pleasant review. I'm not a big David Nail fan. Just friendly warning there. Otherwise, if you'd like to check out any of my existing reviews, go subscribe in the channel. If you might think that there's anything I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or if there's any other albums that you'd like me to cover going forward, I'd be more than happy to take a listen. So until then, see you next time.